Welcome back to the daily Rambam class. We are up to the fourth chapter of Sha'ar Avos Hatubos, other forms of impurities. And today we move on to the last three chapters. We spoke about dead animals and how they impart impurity. And in today's chapter, we move on to the next topic of insects that impart impurity. Quite a fascinating topic. 14 halachas. Let's hit it. The 8 crawling animals that are mentioned in the Torah are the weasel, the mouse, the ferret, the hedgehog, the chameleon, the lizard, the snail, and the mole. The impurity of them all is the same. They are each referred to as a sheret with regards to impurity. So when we talk about the impurity, the source of impurity called the sherets, we are referring to these 8 types of animals. Sorry about that. So we have our 8 types of insects that are sources of impurity called a sheret in the singular or shratzim in the plural. There's no bit of a measure for the limbs of a sheret to impart impurity. To impart impurity, a limb of a sheret must be intact as when it came into being. So the smallest source of impurity, I believe, is a sheret, a limb of a sheret. A limb of a sheret that is intact with flesh, sinews, and bones that is less than a lentil-sized portion, whether it was separated from the sheret while it is alive or after it died, imparts impurity, even though it's less than the size of a lentil. It must have enough flesh or marrow within the bone to regenerate and return to a state of wholeness. So as long as it has flesh, sinews, and bones, it can impart impurity. When flesh is separated from a living sheret, it is pure. Only a limb which is comparable to an entire sheret imparts impurity. What is meant by comparable? Just as a sheret possesses flesh, sinews, and bones, so too a limb separated from it must possess flesh, sinews, and bones, which is why if it's flesh alone, it does not impart impurity. A kidney, a liver, the tongue, and the like, even though they are considered as organs and will not regenerate, are considered as flesh alone in this context. And therefore, if they were separated from the living sherets, they are pure. The blood of a sheret is considered again as its flesh. It can be combined to reach the minimum measure of a lentil-sized portion as long as it is connected to its flesh. So if it's a whole limb, so we say there's no minimum size. If it's an incomplete limb, then it needs to be at least the size of a lentil, and the blood can contribute to that. The bones of a sheret, its sinews and its nails are pure. The hides of the weasel, the mouse, the ferret, and the mole are pure. This applies even though it is still flesh. It was not processed or trodden upon, so even though it hasn't changed form. The hides of the hedgehog, the chameleon, the lizard, and the snail, by contrast, are considered as their flesh, and therefore a lentil-sized portion of it imparts impurity. I thought we just said that flesh alone does not impart impurity. Maybe it was saying if it's less than the size of a lentil. If it was processed or trodden upon to the extent that it is processed, then it becomes pure. But how long must one tread on a hide in order to process it that it no longer is considered as skin and no longer impart impurity? For as long as it takes to walk 4 mil, a mil is about a kilometer, so about 4 kilometers of steps. I guess if a meter is around 2 steps, and then you're talking about approximately 8,000 steps. When a person touches the thigh bone of a sheret, so we spoke about the kulya, the thigh bone. What's unique about it is that it's sealed at both ends. It's like a complete bone. So he is pure, even though it is filled with marrow, provided the marrow in it rattles, for then it could not regenerate flesh where the sherets have been alive. If, however, it is in its natural place and it has sufficient marrow that it could regenerate flesh on the outside of the bone, then one who touches it is impure, as is true with regards to all the limbs that could regenerate flesh, as we explained. If the thigh bone was perforated even to the slightest degree, then one who touches any part of it would become impure. Now, because he has access to it's not just the bone that he's touching the meat inside of the bone as well. An egg of a sheretz in which the embryo has begun to take form. So there's already there's life in that egg. It's still pure, even though the embryonic sheretz can be seen within it. If it is perforated to the slightest degree, then you would be impure, though. The egg. The following laws apply with regards to the carcass of a sheretz that is half flesh and half earth. Fascinating halacha. Generally, we speak about four types of creations. There's the inanimate, which is like stone or earth. Then there's the vegetation. Grass has more life. And then animals have more life and people have more life. But the halacha speaks about a midway, an insect that is halfway between earth and life. So if he touched the flesh part, he's impure. If he touched the earth part, he's pure. If the form of the sheretz was already apparent over its entire length, even one who touches the earth that has not yet been formed into a sheretz is impure. When the flesh of a sheretz has decomposed, becomes spoiled, and is unfit to be eaten even by a dog, then it is pure. The following laws apply if the carcass of a sheretz dries out like a shard. If it would return to a moist state and be fit for a dog to eat, if it was left to soak in lukewarm water for a whole day, then even though right now it's hard like stone, the fact that it has the potential to become soft again means that it still imparts impurity. If not, even with 24 hours of warm water, it would remain hard like stone. Then at this point it is pure. It is no longer considered a carcass. It does not even impart impurity, just like impure foods do, or not even the impurity of impure foods, which is a lesser form of impurity. When does the Rambam apply with regards to a portion of a sheretz? If, however, an entire sheretz has become dry and its skeleton remains intact, or it was burned and its skeleton remains intact, since its entire form remains, it does impart impurity. But the Rambam says, in my eyes, this seems to be rabbinic. Halacha 13, an olive-sized portion of meat from an animal carcass, or a lentil-sized portion from the carcass. So again, now we're combining the previous three chapters in the fourth chapter. In the first chapters, we spoke about meat of an animal. And chapter 4, we spoke about a sheretz. So when we spoke about meat of an animal, we spoke about it having to be at least the size of a kazayas to impart impurity. When we speak about a sheretz, since it's a stronger form of impurity, there's 8 creatures. So if it was the size of a lentil, so in either two scenarios, whether it was an olive-sized carcass of an animal, flesh of an animal, or a lentil size of a sheretz, an insect, of these 8 insects, and it shrunk. So originally it met the minimum measure to be able to impart impurity, but now it's become smaller, so then it is pure. If a piece of flesh from a sheretz that is less than a lentil, or an animal carcass that was less than a kazayas, an olive size, originally it was less than the size, and then the flesh swelled and increased to the size of the minimum measure, then since right now it is a kazayas, rabbinic, scripturally speaking, it doesn't impart impurity because in its original source it was less than the minimal size. But by rabbinic law it does. If originally they were the size of the minimum measure, they shrunk and then they re-swelled and they regained their minimum size, then even by Torah law, they impart impurity like they did previously. So if the starting point and ending point was the minimal size, then we ignore the in-between. Similar laws apply with regards to the unsized portion from a human corpse. Finally, our last halacha number 14, the sheretz does not impart impurity until it dies. If it has been decapitated, even if the head is still connected to the skin of the body, and it is still in its death throes, as happens with regards to the tail of a lizard. I don't know if you've ever seen that. So it already imparts impurity. So although it's still moving, once it's been decapitated, then it's the tail of a lizard, although it's still moving, will not impart impurity. All the other teeming and creeping animals, like a frog, a snake, a scorpion, or the like, even though it is forbidden to partake of them, they do not impart impurity at all. They are not even considered as impure foods. There are no teeming animals that impart impurity except the 8 species mentioned in the Torah. Test yourself.
A question before we
yes.
do the test.
Yes.
The concept of impurity. The concept of impurity is extremely important. Yeah, the determination is almost impossible for a Amaretz or even person to check. How are you going to check whether if I added water, it was going to come back to life? This is almost an impossible test from a practical point of view.
Well, we're talking about a very unusual scenario where there was discovered a carcass in the person's dough or whatever food it was, and now he wants to know, is he impure or not? So he wants to know, does he need to go through the whole process of purity? And he wouldn't need to wait the full 24 hours. He can, maybe already an hour later it would become soft, and then he would know that he was impure. If by the end of 24 hours, it still didn't become loose enough, it still remained hard, then now he knows that he's pure. Nothing more is necessary. So I guess, that's why when it comes to sacrificial foods and entering the temple, a person would need to be called a chaver. A chaver is somebody that's quite familiar with the laws. The regular guy was not trusted because he wasn't familiar with all the different forms of impurity, like those of the 8 insects that we spoke about necessarily, or something that people would need to be educated in. Okay. Which of the following statements are incorrect? A sheretz imparts impurity to one who touches it. A sheretz imparts impurity to one who carries it. A sheretz imparts impurity to an earthenware vessel when it enters its inner space. Something is wrong. Either I skipped, or the question is from a different chapter. No, I skipped. I don't remember doing halacha number 2. Unless I did it, I don't remember. I'm going to do it again now. A sheretz is considered as a primary source of impurity and imparts impurity to persons and vessels when touched, and to an earthenware container when it enters its inner space. It does not impart impurity when carried, and one who touches it does not impart impurity to his clothes when touching it. The minimum measure that imparts impurity is a lentil-sized portion. All the shratzim can be combined to reach this measure. I don't know what happened, but I somehow skipped out halacha number 2. Mm-hmm. And I was actually wondering why we didn't mention the lentil size.
Yeah.
So now I know. Now back to the questions. Good thing we have the questions. The sheretz imparts impurity to one who touches it, to one who carries it, to an earthenware vessel when it enters its inner space, which is incorrect.
Number 1.
2.
Number 2. Number 2. If you touch it, you'll become impure, but if you carry it, you don't. So you don't need to worry about some sheretz that maybe fell on your backpack or something. That's not going to make you impure, only if you actually touched it. True or false? The blood of a sheretz does not impart impurity on its own.
True.
I think it's true. I think we said it only combines to the measure.
Yeah.
Does the egg of a sheretz impart impurity? Yes, only if it is perforated slightly, or no?
Number 2.
Correct. Finally, question number 4. Which of the following creatures are not one of the 8 shiratzim? A mouse, a camelid, or a snake?
Snake.
Correct.
No.
Thank you so much for joining. Wishing you a good year and a wonderful week.
Thank you.